The gunshot cracked across the dusty main street of Copper Creek, and every single soul who had gathered to watch the spectacle went dead silent. Beatrice Keller was on her face in the dirt. The taste of blood and shame filled her mouth. Her honey-blonde hair, usually pinned up with such care, was spilling into the filth of the street. Above her, Clayton Rhodes stood tall, his face twisted in a smug, ugly grin. The revolver in his hand was still smoking, fired into the air just to make a point. "That'll teach you to talk back to a man, you uppity little—" Clayton's words died right in his throat, because a shadow had just fallen over him. A tall figure stepped between Rhodes and Beatrice's crumpled form. "She won't be needing any more lessons from you," a new voice said. It was low, calm, but it cut through the silence like a razor. His hand hovered near the worn walnut grip of his own Colt, but his eyes never, ever left Clayton's face. "And you won't be laying another hand on her. Not today. Not ever again." This was 1878 in the Colorado Territory, and in this part of the world, men like Clayton Rhodes were used to taking exactly what they wanted. What they weren't used to was someone standing in their way. Beatrice pushed herself up on one elbow, tasting the split in her lip. The humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain. She watched this newcomer, this lean, weathered cowboy she'd never laid eyes on before, stand his ground against the man who had been terrorizing her for 6 long months, ever since her father died. "This ain't your business, stranger," Clayton snarled, but you could see it. His gun hand was trembling, just a little. Even drunk, Clayton Rhodes recognized the steady, practiced stance of a man who had drawn his weapon for real before. "I'm making it my business," the stranger replied, his voice flat. "Now, back away from the lady." The crowd on the boardwalk shifted. You could hear the whispers starting up. How shameful. James Keller's daughter, sprawled in the dirt like a common saloon girl. How inappropriate for her to have refused Clayton's advances so publicly, again. But this cowboy, this Mason Caldwell, he didn't seem to care one bit about propriety. He didn't take his eyes off Clayton, but he reached a hand down toward Beatrice. Clayton was backing away now, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. "You all right, miss?" the cowboy asked. Beatrice hesitated. Then she took the offered hand. His palm was rough, covered in calluses, but his grip was surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. "I'm fine," she lied, brushing the filth from her skirts, trying to find any scrap of dignity she had left. "Thank you for your help, but I could have handled—" "Sure you could," he interrupted, and the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "But my ma taught me better than to stand by when a lady's in trouble." Clayton had backed all the way to the saloon doors, but his parting shot hung in the air like poison. "This ain't over, Caldwell." The cowboy finally turned his full attention to Beatrice, and she found herself looking into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face. "Mason Caldwell," he said, giving a slight tip of his hat. "Just passing through." "Beatrice Keller," she replied stiffly, painfully aware of every eye on them. "And I believe you've just made an enemy of the most powerful and most dangerous man in Copper Creek." Mason just shrugged, completely unconcerned. "Wouldn't be the first time I've managed that." He looked her over, his gaze landing on her split lip and the red mark blooming on her cheek. "Can I escort you somewhere safe, Miss Keller?" Beatrice straightened her spine. "I own the mercantile at the end of the street. I was just heading back." She didn't add that Clayton had been drinking since noon, that he'd cornered her, that he'd become more and more aggressive ever since her father's death left her alone, in charge of the family business. Mason nodded and just fell into step beside her. He seemed totally oblivious to the scandalized looks, the curtains twitching in windows. But Beatrice felt them like a brand. Walking with an unknown gunman moments after being knocked down by the town tyrant. The gossips would be eating this up for a month. "You're new to town," she said, just to break the silence. "Just rode in this morning," he confirmed. "Looking for work, or maybe just a place to rest a spell." "And what kind of work?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Does a man like you do, Mr. Caldwell?" Men who were this comfortable with a gun usually had complicated, bloody pasts. His mouth quirked up at one corner. "I've been a ranch hand, a horse trainer, even tried mining once. Wasn't much good at digging." They reached the Mercantile, a solid two-story building. Keller's General Goods was painted in neat letters across the front. The bell above the door jingled as Beatrice pushed it open, and she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, just to be out of sight. "Miss Keller?" A young woman with copper-colored hair, Margaret, hurried from behind the counter. Her eyes went wide as she took in Beatrice's face. "What on earth happened to you?" "Nothing to concern yourself with, Margaret," Beatrice said briskly. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Margaret Walsh, my assistant." Mason tipped his hat. "Ma'am?" Margaret's gaze darted between the two of them, burning with questions. "Could you fetch some ice for Miss Keller's face?" Mason asked. It wasn't a request. Margaret glanced at Beatrice, got a small nod, and hurried to the back room. "You should sit down," Mason said, pulling out a chair. "I should ask you to leave," Beatrice countered, though she sank onto the chair, her legs suddenly weak. "You've done enough damage." His eyebrows rose. "Damage? Clayton Rhodes is not a man to cross," she said, lowering her voice. "He owns the bank. He owns half the businesses in this town. And he has Sheriff Dawson in his pocket. And now, thanks to you, he thinks I've allied myself with you." Mason leaned against the counter, his posture infuriatingly relaxed. "I've met men like Rhodes before, Miss Keller. They only understand one thing, that there's always someone faster, someone stronger, someone who isn't afraid of them." "And that's you, I suppose?" she snapped. He shrugged again. "For today, at least." Margaret returned with a cloth-wrapped bundle of ice. Beatrice pressed it to her throbbing cheek. "That will be all, Margaret," Beatrice said. "You can go home early today." Margaret looked disappointed to be missing the rest of the show, but she gathered her shawl and left, casting one last curious look over her shoulder. When the bell jingled shut, leaving them alone, Beatrice let out a long sigh. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your intervention, but it would be best if you moved on from Copper Creek as soon as possible. Clayton won't forget this, and I cannot afford any more trouble." "Trouble seems to have found you already, Miss Keller," Mason observed quietly. "Has he been harassing you long?" Beatrice stiffened. "My personal affairs are none of your concern." "They became my concern when I stepped between you and his fist," Mason pointed out, his voice mild. "And they'll be the whole town's concern if you don't have someone watching your back." "I don't need—" "Everyone needs someone," he interrupted, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Even stubborn, independent shopkeepers." Despite herself, a small smile tugged at her split lip. "Is that what I am?" "Among other things, I'd wager," he said. His blue eyes were warm, with something that looked like admiration. "Brave, for one. Not many would stand up to a man like Rhodes in public." "Foolish, more likely," she murmured. "My father always said I never knew when to hold my tongue." "Sometimes," Mason said, his expression softening. "Speaking up is the only way to keep your soul intact." The simple truth of it silenced her. She studied him again, really looked at him. The way he stood balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move. The faded white scar that ran along his jaw. The quiet confidence of a man who had faced down far worse than a drunken bully and lived. "Why did you help me, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked finally. He considered it. "Because it was the right thing to do. And because I've seen too many people get hurt when good folks stand by and do nothing." Something in his tone told her that was a personal story, a painful one. She stood up, moving behind the counter, the familiar territory of her store. Well, whatever your reasons, I thank you. Now, was there something you needed to purchase? Or were you just passing through to play knight errant? His mouth twitched. Actually, I could use some supplies. Tobacco, coffee, and some jerky for the trail. As she gathered the items, grateful for the return to normal business, she asked, "Will you really leave town?" "Planning on it," he said, counting out the coins. "But plans have a way of changing." "Not this one," she insisted. "Clayton has friends, Mr. Caldwell, men who won't hesitate to shoot you in the back." He pocketed his purchases. "Your concern is touching, Miss Keller." "It's not concern," she said too quickly. "I simply don't want another death on my conscience." His expression went still, serious. "Has there been a first?" Beatrice turned away, fussing with a stack of bolts of cloth. "My father," she said, her voice quiet and tight. "He stood up to Clayton over a loan. 3 days later, he was found dead behind the saloon. The sheriff called it a robbery gone wrong. But you don't believe that." It wasn't a question. "I can't prove otherwise," she admitted. "But no, I don't." Mason was silent for a long, heavy moment. When she finally turned back, his face had hardened. The easygoing charm was gone, replaced by something cold and dark. "Miss Keller," he said finally, "I think I might stay in Copper Creek a bit longer after all." Before she could argue, the bell above the door jingled. Sheriff Dawson stepped inside, his hand resting casually on his holster. His gaze slid from Beatrice's bruised face to Mason and back again. "Heard there was some trouble earlier," the lawman drawled. "Rhodes says this fella threatened him." "That's not what happened," Beatrice began, but Mason cut her off. "Miss Keller was assaulted," he said bluntly. "Knocked to the ground. I suggested to Mr. Rhodes that it wouldn't happen again." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" He looked at Beatrice's cheek. "Seems to me a lady ought to know better than to provoke a gentleman." A cold fury, colder than the ice on her face, shot through Beatrice, but Mason spoke first. "Is that the law in this town, Sheriff?" Mason's voice was dangerously mild. "That a man can strike a woman if he feels provoked?" Sheriff Dawson flushed a deep red. "Now see here, stranger." "No, you see here," Mason interrupted, his voice dropping. "Miss Keller was assaulted in broad daylight, and instead of arresting the man who did it, you're in here, lecturing her." The sheriff's hand tightened on his gun. "I don't know who you think you are, stranger, but—" "He's my new hired hand," Beatrice blurted out. The words surprised her as much as they surprised the two men. Mason recovered first. He nodded, as if this had been the plan all along. "That's right, Sheriff. Mr. Caldwell will be working for me, helping with deliveries and security." "That's right," Mason echoed, picking up his cue. "So if anyone has a problem with Miss Keller, they can take it up with me." Sheriff Dawson looked between them, his eyes full of suspicion. "Rhodes ain't gonna like this." "Mr. Rhodes," Beatrice said, finding her strength, "doesn't have a say in who I employ. Now, was there something you needed to purchase, Sheriff? Otherwise, we're closing for the day." The lawman grumbled something about women getting above themselves, but he turned and left, the bell announcing his angry departure. Beatrice turned to Mason, a mix of embarrassment and defiance on her face. I don't know why I said that." Mason's slow smile made her heart do a strange, unfamiliar flip. "Seemed pretty smart to me. But if you're determined to stay and make trouble," she continued, pushing past her fluster, "you might as well be useful while you're doing it." "Yes, ma'am," he said, that smile lingering. "I believe I could be very useful indeed." "The job pays room and board plus $2 a week," she said. "All business. There's a small apartment above the store. You can stay there." His eyebrow quirked. "Above the store? Where you stay?" "Folks might talk," he observed. Beatrice lifted her chin. Folks are already talking, Mr. Caldwell. At least this way, I'll have some protection when Clayton decides to make good on his next threat. Mason studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded once. All right, Miss Keller. You've got yourself a hired hand. She showed him up the stairs to the small room at the back of the second floor, separated from her own quarters by a narrow hallway. It wasn't much. A narrow bed, a washstand, a battered chest of drawers. It's clean, at least, she said. I've slept in worse, Mason assured her, dropping his saddlebags on the bed. Much worse. Beatrice hesitated at the door. The reality of what she'd just done hit her. She'd invited a total stranger, a man with a gun and a dark past, to live under her roof. He turned, reading her expression easily. You're wondering if you've made a mistake, trusting me. She didn't deny it. I don't know anything about you. What would you like to know? He asked, direct as a bullet. Where? Where are you from? Texas, he said. Small ranch. My father raised horses. And your family? Are they still there? A shadow passed over his face, so quick she almost missed it. No, they're gone. The words were simple, but they held a world of pain. I'm sorry, she said softly. He just shrugged, that deflecting gesture she was starting to recognize. It was a long time ago. He moved to the single window, looking down at the street. Rhodes is across the way, at the saloon, watching the store. Beatrice joined him, staying back from the glass. Sure enough, Clayton stood on the boardwalk, his gaze fixed on her front door. Even from this distance, she could see the fury in his stance. He won't give up easily, she warned. Men like that always fall the hardest, Mason said. It wasn't a boast, it was a statement of fact. You sound like you've seen it happen. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Once or twice. He looked at her, his gaze intense. Miss Keller, he won't hurt you again, not while I'm here. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried to her own room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. That night, she lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in her home. The creak of floorboards as he paced, the metallic, oily click of a gun being checked and loaded. Instead of frightening her, the sound was comforting. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't alone. The next morning, the bell on the store's front door jingled at precisely 8 a.m. Beatrice looked up from the counter, and her stomach dropped. Clayton Rhodes strode in, flanked by his 2 usual thugs, rough-looking men named Williams and Pike. Well, well, Clayton drawled. His eyes were bloodshot, but he was sober this morning. That was worse. He looked at Beatrice's bruised cheek with no remorse at all. If it isn't the town's most stubborn shopkeeper, I hear you've taken in a stray. Mr. Rhodes, Beatrice said, her voice shaking only slightly. If you're here to make a purchase, I'll assist you. Otherwise, please leave. We're busy. Is that what you call it? Mason's voice came from the storeroom. He emerged, carrying a heavy crate of canned goods. He set it down with a deliberate thud before facing Clayton. Seemed more like harassment to me. Clayton's face darkened. You're still here. I work here now, Mason replied, his voice even. Not for long, Williams growled, his hand dropping to his gun. Williams, Clayton cautioned, putting a hand on his man's arm. His smile returned, all teeth. No need for that. Yet. He turned his attention back to Beatrice, his eyes glittering. I just came to deliver a message. As your banker, the bank will be calling in your father's loan at the end of the month. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. What? That's impossible. The terms were for 2 years. We've never missed a payment. Terms change, Clayton said with a casual shrug. Business is business. You've got 30 days to pay the full amount, or the bank takes the store. This isn't business, Mason cut in, his voice dangerously low. It's extortion. Watch your mouth, Cowboy, Clayton snapped. You're in no position to be making accusations. And you're in no position to be changing loan agreements on a whim, Mason countered. Unless banking laws have changed. The air crackled. For a second, Beatrice was sure guns would be drawn. Then Clayton took a step back, his smile victorious. He had her. He knew it. 1 month, Beatrice, he repeated. And I suggest you find yourself a new hired hand by then. This one seems bad for your health. He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture, and turned, his men following him out. The bell jingled, and they were gone. Beatrice sank onto a stool, her legs giving out. He can't. He can't do this. She whispered it, but she knew he could. The store doesn't make that kind of money all at once. He knows that. That's the point, Mason said grimly, his face hard as granite. He wants you desperate enough to accept his courtship, to save your business. Never, Beatrice said, a fierce sudden anger burning through her fear. I'd burn this place to the ground first. Mason looked at her, and that small flicker of admiration was back in his eyes. It won't come to that. How can you be so sure? We have 30 days. Because, Mason said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, a lot can happen in 30 days. Let me see the loan agreement. She retrieved it from the strongbox under the counter, her hands trembling. She'd read it a dozen times. It was hopeless. She handed it to him. Mason scanned the document. He was silent for a long time. What? She finally asked. He looked up, his blue eyes narrowed. Your father's signature. Was his hand steady near the end? Beatrice blinked. What? No, he had rheumatism. His writing was shaky. Why? Mason laid the paper on the counter and pointed. Look at it. She looked. The signature, James T. Keller, was perfect. A strong, confident script. It's too neat, she whispered. It's a forgery, Mason said, his voice flat. Rhodes didn't just give your father a loan. He fabricated the entire document. This paper isn't worth the ink it's written on. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her despair. But how do we prove it? We need a comparison and real signature. Where would he have signed official papers? Mason asked. The bank, Beatrice said, and her hope died. On his account, or at the town hall, the deed for the store, the business ledger. And Rhodes owns the bank, Mason finished, and the sheriff keeps the town records. It's hopeless, she said. They're all locked up. Not all of them, Mason said, his gaze drifting to the street. The sheriff has a deputy, young fellow, name of Eli. Deputy Eli? He's just a boy. He's terrified of Rhodes. Maybe, Mason said, a glint in his eye. But I'd wager he's also a man who's tired of watching his boss lick a bully's boots. Let me have a word with him. That night, Mason found Deputy Eli at the saloon, nursing a beer, trying to look invisible. Mason slid onto the stool next to him. You know what Rhodes did to Miss Keller, Mason said, not bothering with introductions. Eli jumped, spilling his drink. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'll bet you know what really happened to her father. Mason pushed, his voice low. Eli's face went pale. You'd best move on, stranger. You're making trouble. Trouble's already here, Mason said. All I need, deputy, is for you to be a little clumsy. The back window of the records room. Forget to latch it tonight. That's all. He'll kill me, Eli whispered, terrified. He'll kill her if you do nothing, Mason said, standing up. Your choice. Beatrice watched from her window as Mason slipped into the shadows of the alley behind the sheriff's office. Her heart was a cold lump of ice in her chest. This was insane. An hour later he was back, climbing silently through her kitchen window. He was empty-handed. What happened? She whispered. I got in, he said, his voice tight with frustration. I found the town business ledger. I opened it to your father's name. And? The whole page is new, he said grimly. The ink is still dark. It's another forgery, a perfect match to the one you have. Rhodes cleaned the slate. Beatrice sagged against the wall. So that's it. We have nothing. Not nothing, Mason said. He was pacing now, a caged tiger. We just went about it the wrong way. We tried to find a document. We should have been looking for a person. What do you mean? Your father's death. You said it was a robbery. Who pronounced him dead? Dr. Evans, Beatrice said. He's an old man, a friend of my father's. A friend, Mason said, who signed a death certificate that called a murder a robbery. Let's go pay the doctor a visit. Dr. Evans's house was dark, but a light burned in his study. When he answered their knock, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Miss Keller, Mr. Caldwell, it's late. We need to talk to you, doctor, Beatrice said, pushing past him into the house. It's about my father's death. The old man trembled, collapsing into his chair. I did what I had to. He told me. Rhodes. He said he'd ruin me. He said he'd harm my daughter in Denver. I had no choice. You lied, Beatrice said, the accusation hanging in the air. Yes, the doctor cried, tears streaming down his face. Yes, I lied. It wasn't a robbery. He was shot. In the back. Did you? Mason started. Did I get the bullet? The doctor interrupted, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. He went to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box. I told myself it was for science. But I knew. I knew one day. I couldn't live with the lie. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of cotton, was a deformed piece of lead. I dug it out of him myself, Dr. Evans whispered. It's from a .44 caliber. The same kind of custom revolver Clayton Rhodes carries. I'd stake my life on it. Beatrice stared at the bullet. This was it. This was the proof. Not of fraud. Of murder. Suddenly, a massive crash echoed from down the street, the sound of the Mercantile's front window shattering. He knows, Mason said, his face a mask. He was already drawing his gun. He must have had someone watching you, doctor. He knows you talked. He turned to Beatrice. Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. No, Beatrice said, grabbing the small revolver she kept in the strongbox. He's in my home. They ran from the doctor's house, down the dark street. The front of the Mercantile was a ruin of shattered glass. They slipped in through the back. Where is it, old man? They heard Williams's voice snarling from upstairs. Rhodes wants what the doctor gave you. He's not here, another voice yelled. It was Pike. They were tearing her home apart. Then we'll wait, Williams laughed. Mason held up a hand, motioning for Beatrice to stay put. He crept up the stairs, silent as smoke. Beatrice held her breath, her gun shaking in her hand. She heard a scuffle, a grunt of surprise, a heavy thud, then Williams's voice. Pike! Pike! You answer me! Silence. Caldwell! Williams roared. I know you're in here! Come out and face me! Mason appeared at the top of the stairs, Pike's gun in his belt. I'm right here, Williams! Williams charged up the stairs, firing wildly. Mason fired back. The hallway exploded with noise and smoke. Beatrice screamed as a bullet slammed into the wall next to her head. Williams burst out of the smoke, tackling Mason. They crashed back into Beatrice's room, a tangle of limbs. Beatrice ran up, her gun raised, but they were moving too fast, rolling, smashing furniture. Mason landed a brutal punch to Williams's jaw. The man was stunned, and Mason scrambled for his gun. But Williams was fast. He didn't go for his own gun. He kicked Mason in the ribs, lunged for the bedroom window, and smashed straight through it, glass and wood exploding into the night. Mason staggered to the broken window, gun raised, but Williams was gone, landing on the stable roof below and disappearing into the darkness. He was wounded, bleeding from a cut on his arm, but he had escaped. "He's gone to Rhodes," Mason panted, clutching his side. Beatrice ran to him. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." He was already moving, checking Pike, who was unconscious but alive on the landing. "We have to go. Now." "Go? Go where?" "Silver Creek," he said, grabbing her arm. "That's where the federal marshal's office is. We can't trust anyone in this town, not even Eli. Rhodes owns it all. We have to get this bullet and the doctor's confession to the marshal. Tonight? In the dark?" "Especially in the dark," Mason said, grabbing his saddlebags. "They'll be watching the main road. We'll have to take the high trail. Pack a bag. Bring food, a coat, and the bullet. We're leaving in 10 minutes. They slipped out the back of the mercantile, leading the horses. The town was dark, but it felt alive. Alive with eyes. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. They left Copper Creek by the old mining trails, climbing into the mountains as a storm began to roll in, the wind howling, covering the sound of their escape. They rode for hours, the rain turning to icy sleet. Beatrice was soaked to the bone, her hands numb on the reins. "We have to stop," Mason finally yelled over the wind. "There's an old line shack up ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there." The shack was barely standing, but its roof was mostly intact. Mason got a small, smoky fire going in the stone fireplace, while Beatrice huddled in a dry, rotted blanket. "He'll never find us here," she said, her teeth chattering. "Don't count on it," Mason said, peering out a crack in the wall. "Williams knows these hills as well as I do." They sat in silence, the only sound the storm raging outside. "Mason?" she finally whispered. "Why are you doing this? You could have just kept riding." He looked at her, his face lit by the small fire. "I told you. I've seen what happens when men like Rhodes are left to do as they please." He paused, his voice dropping. "You asked about my family. You don't have to." "I was a Texas Ranger," he said, cutting her off, needing to say it. "I was away on a long patrol, tracking a gang. When I got back, my ranch was gone, burned to the ground." "Comanches?" she whispered, remembering what he'd said. "No," he said, and his voice was raw. "Not Comanches. A cattle baron. A man just like Rhodes. He wanted my land, my water. I wouldn't sell, so he hired men to scare my wife, Sarah. But she fought back. Her and my boy, they didn't survive the fire." Beatrice's heart broke. She moved across the dirt floor and took his hand. "I hunted them down," he continued, his voice dead. "The men who lit the match, and the baron who paid them. I didn't bring them to justice, Beatrice. I brought them vengeance, the Rangers. They didn't see the difference. They took my badge. I've been drifting ever since, until I saw Rhodes knock you down. And I saw it all happening again. I couldn't walk away. Not again." Beatrice squeezed his hand, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "You're not that man anymore, Mason. You're not him." "Am I?" he asked. Before she could answer, his head snapped up. He threw himself at her, tackling her to the dirt floor, just as a bullet ripped through the wall where she'd been sitting. "He found us!" Mason yelled, shoving her behind the rusted-out stove. "It's the posse!" Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the thin wooden walls of the shack. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. "How many?" Beatrice screamed over the noise. "Too many!" Mason yelled back, firing his Colt through a gap in the logs. "It's Rhodes. I see him. And Williams." The shack was being torn to pieces around them. They were trapped. "This is it," Beatrice whispered, clutching the small box with the bullet. "No, it's not," Mason said, his eyes wild. He grabbed the oil lamp, the one they'd lit when they came in. "The back door, it opens over the ravine. It's a 50-foot drop. And it's muddy," he said. He waited for a huge crack of thunder, one that shook the very ground. "Now!" He kicked open the back door. In the same motion, he hurled the lit lantern toward the trees where the posse's horses were tied. The lantern shattered. Oil and fire exploded. The horses screamed in terror, rearing and scattering into the storm. "Go!" Mason roared, shoving Beatrice out the door. They didn't jump. They slid, tumbling down the 50-foot mudslide of the ravine, landing in a heap in the freezing creek at the bottom. Above them, they heard shouting, cursing. The posse was in chaos, their horses gone. "Don't stop," Mason panted, pulling her to her feet. "Run!" They ran, following the creek, stumbling over rocks, soaked and freezing, but alive. They'd escaped. Dawn broke clear and cold. They had made it. They were on the final ridge overlooking the pass to Silver Creek. They were exhausted, bruised, but they had the evidence. "We're going to make it," Beatrice said, relief washing over her. They started down the narrow trail into the pass. Mason went first. They were halfway through when the shot rang out. It wasn't from behind, it was from above. Mason's horse screamed as a bullet struck the rock face inches from his head. "Ambush!" Mason roared, drawing his gun and shoving Beatrice toward a cluster of boulders. "Take cover!" More shots from the ridge above. "It's a trap!" Beatrice cried. "They knew we'd come this way." "It's Williams!" Mason yelled, firing back at the puff of smoke. "And two others. They sent the posse as a diversion and waited for us here." The gunfight was fast, brutal. Mason was good, but he was outgunned, 3-1. "You have to ride, Beatrice," he yelled, reloading. "I'm not leaving you." "The evidence!" he roared, his face desperate. "The bullet! It's the only thing that matters. It's the only way he pays. You have to get it to the marshal. Go!" "No!" He grabbed her, his face inches from hers. "You wanted to fight. This is the fight. Now ride!" He shoved her horse, slapping its rump hard. The horse bolted, flying down the pass. Beatrice screamed, pulling at the reins, but it was too late. She looked back, just for a second, and she saw it. A bullet slammed into Mason's chest. He staggered, clutching his side, and went down. "Mason!" William stood up on the ridge, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of triumph. He started walking down the goat trail toward Mason, savoring the moment. "This is for my arm, Ranger," he called out. Beatrice was frozen. "Go back or ride for help?" Williams raised his pistol to finish Mason. Bang! A new shot, from a new direction. Williams jerked, hit in the shoulder, spinning around. At the mouth of the pass, rifle in hand, was Deputy Eli. "You chose the wrong side, Williams!" Eli yelled. A furious gunfight erupted between the deputy and Williams's two men. "Go, Miss Keller!" Eli screamed, diving behind a rock as bullets chipped the stone around him. "Get the marshal! I'll hold them!" Tears streaming down her face, Beatrice turned her horse and rode like she'd never ridden before, the hoofbeats pounding out a single rhythm. "Get help! Get help! Get help!" She burst into Silver Creek, a madwoman covered in mud and blood. She fell off her horse and staggered into the federal marshal's office. "Marshal Wilson?" she gasped. A grizzled, tall man with a sweeping mustache looked up. "That's me." "Clayton Rhodes," she panted, throwing the wooden box and the doctor's confession on his desk. "He murdered my father. He's in the pass. His men. They've killed. They're killing them." Marshal Wilson took one look at the bullet and the note. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle. "Saddle up, boys!" he roared to his office. "We're deputizing the whole street. We've got a snake to kill." They rode back hard, a posse of 10 men. When they reached the pass, it was silent. Beatrice's heart stopped. She saw blood, so much blood on the rocks. Then she saw him. Deputy Eli slumped against a boulder, shot in the leg, but alive. Williams was dead. His 2 men were dead. "Eli, where's Mason?" Beatrice cried, running to him. Eli grunted, clutching his leg. He was hit. Bad. But he was alive. When I finished Williams, he took off. On his horse." "He left?" "Not left," Eli said, wincing. "He went after him. Rhodes. He was on the ridge, too, when he saw me. He fled. Back to Copper Creek. Mason went after him to finish it. "He's in no condition," Marshal Wilson barked. "Let's ride." They raced back to Copper Creek, pushing their horses to the limit. They found them on Main Street, right where it all began. Clayton Rhodes was on his horse, his saddlebags packed, ready to flee. But his way was blocked. Mason was on the ground, slumped against the town's watering trough, his shirt soaked in blood. But his hand was steady. His Colt was aimed right at Clayton's heart. "You're not running, Clayton," Mason breathed, barely able to speak. "You're dead, Caldwell," Rhodes snarled, his hand hovering over his own gun. "Maybe," Mason whispered, "but you'll be dead first." "It's over, Rhodes." Marshal Wilson's voice boomed as the posse surrounded them, guns drawn from every direction. Clayton looked at the marshal. He looked at the guns. He looked at Beatrice, alive, and his face, the smug, arrogant face of a tyrant. It just collapsed. Justice had finally come to Copper Creek. Mason recovered. So did Eli. The trial in Denver was swift. With the bullet, the doctor's testimony, and Deputy Eli's, Clayton Rhodes was found guilty of the murder of James Keller. He was sent to prison for life. The federal investigation into his bank uncovered years of fraud, and his entire empire crumbled. Deputy Eli was hailed as a hero. He became the new sheriff, and he was a good one. Beatrice returned to her store, and Mason didn't leave. He stayed. He helped her rebuild the broken window. He helped her rebuild her life. 6 months later, they stood in the small-town church. Beatrice wore a simple white dress. Mason stood tall, his side healed, his eyes only on her. "I, Mason Caldwell, take you, Beatrice Keller," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to be my lawfully wedded wife." "I, Beatrice Keller, take you, Mason Caldwell," she said, her voice shaking with joy, "to be my lawfully wedded husband." The town celebrated. They had their town back, and Beatrice had found a love she never thought possible. A few weeks later, a new sign was hung outside the store. Margaret had painted it herself. It didn't say Keller's General Goods anymore. It said Keller and Caldwell's Mercantile. 1 year after that, on a crisp autumn evening, Beatrice waited for Mason to come up from the store. When he walked in, she was smiling. "What is it?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered. Mason's eyes, those startling blue eyes that had seen so much pain, filled with a light she'd never seen before. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "A family," he murmured. "A new start." Beatrice looked out the window at the quiet street below. The spot where she had fallen was just dirt. A memory. Sometimes, she thought, you have to be knocked all the way down to find the strength to stand up. And sometimes, the person who helps you up is the one you were meant to stand with forever.